Ladies and gentlemen, my name is TotalBiscuit. I'm here to ask and answer one simple question. WTF is Glare? Glare is not a puzzle platformer. I think you'll be happy to hear that. It's just a regular platformer. And it is by a company called Phobic that haven't really done much on PC whatsoever. They were partially responsible, along with Backflip, for a cow clicker called Dragon Veil, which you might remember. You may have seen it on the iOS store. And a bunch of other titles as well. So this is kind of one of their first big ventures into core games, I suppose, as opposed to that kind of mobile casual stuff. So let's have a look and see whether or not it's any cop. So heading over to the options menu, you will find not too much available here. You can mess with the brightness, and you've got full screen options there. For some reason, like, it was on high by default. I'm not really sure why I didn't just go all the way to ultra, so we can crank it, I suppose. That's really about it in terms of what it actually offers options-wise. And then you've got your keyboard and mouse, which, for the most part, can be... I believe they can be rebound. Yeah, there you go. So, they can be rebound. So, I've tried it with both the keyboard and mouse and the 360 controller. Both work absolutely fine. So, you've got this basic aiming system that either you use the right stick for or you use the mouse to control. Both of them work absolutely fine. There's nothing really to worry about there. And there's not too many controls in general, as I think you can clearly see. So, shall we get into it? Sounds like a pretty good idea. I'm going to go into World 3. It took me about an hour of gameplay to get to. I'm not sure if it counted my failures. Perhaps it did, but yeah, it took me about an hour of gameplay to get to World 3. So, we're going to go from there, I think. And see how it goes. So, welcome to Glare. This is your character. You are basically made of stars. And you are trying to deal with the fact that there are dark creatures all over the place. Now, the reason the game is called Glare is because if you hold down the right mouse button, you are able to glare. And that has numerous results, including growing, say, plant-like creatures that allow you to bounce on them, and also to repel bullets and enemies. Enemies will be driven backwards, bullets will be reflected if you happen to glare at them. So there you go, there's a bunch of nasty dark enemies coming at you. You can't really glare at everything, so it's not a universal catch-all solution. But you do have an arm cannon, handily enough, and of course if you take hits, then you will take damage. I'll get onto that in a minute. I will, I will, oh lord. So the glare is used for the most part just for combat, but there are occasional elements of platforming that you'll need it for. Like, for instance, there are enemies, well, platforms, I suppose. I wouldn't really call them enemies, just kind of malevolent-looking mushrooms. They're more passive-aggressive, I feel. Like, they don't want to kill you, but they'll happily bounce you into thorns given any opportunity. So, I feel that they hate you in a kind of Facebook way. But one way or the other, you can use it to attach to these and sort of rappel across and things like that. And in general, it is a nice utility tool, but it can also be used a little bit in combat. Now, at the start of the game, maybe for the first 20 minutes or so, you don't even have a gun. You are actually reliant on your glare. And then you gain this, like, arm cannon. And at that point, it becomes more of a standard combat platformer. Now, I think, honestly, the decision to go for the combat platforming stuff is a bit of a weakness of the game, because I don't think it does it very well. The arm cannon, you can't even hear it. It doesn't actually have any oomph to it whatsoever. You just kind of hold the button down. You'll even notice that it actually pulses in a way that isn't in time with the number of shots that are coming out of it. There's barely any sound. You'll not be able to hear it. I can't even hear it myself. You certainly will not be able to hear it with the fact that I have to turn the music down and the sound down in general in order to actually be heard over it. I have tried cranking it up to max, and there was barely any sound assets there whatsoever. It's actually one of the biggest weaknesses that the game has got. It's got decent music, and it also sports a supposed dynamic music system, which just means it kind of changes depending on what's going on the screen. I haven't really noticed it to too much of an extent, so it's clearly not a major feature there, but the actual overall sound design of the game is pretty weak, with a degree of inconsistency as to what makes a lot of sound and what doesn't. Those kind of little bouncy things that I just jumped on make way more sound than my gun does. My gun basically makes no sound at all. Let me just shut up for a second and I'll show you exactly how much sound it makes. See, barely any. That's really, really surprising. I mean, I imagine you could probably turn that up there, but if you look at this, the sound volume is actually higher than the music volume in the menu, so you shouldn't even have those kind of problems, but it's there. And, oh, damn it. And unfortunately, it's not the only part of the game to have it. The boss fights are probably the worst offenders. You'd expect maybe just a fantastic sound, a cavalcade of destructive audio coming in as you destroy a boss. But in the 2 boss fights that I've done, the kill has just involved just a squelch. That was it. Just a squelch. It's like, wow, that was the most underwhelming ending to a boss fight. It doesn't help that the boss fights are also pretty much identical. The 2 boss fights that I did, pretty much exactly the same creature, only they did slightly different things. So that wasn't too impressive whatsoever. Now, that's not to say that the game sucks in all aspects. It certainly doesn't. The platforming is pretty solid, yeah? Animation quality on the character is not so good. So, jumping around is not the most satisfying ever. But, especially once you get to level 2 and you gain the ability to slide, there are some really cool platforming sections. You do have the ability to double jump, which is also nice, and you have the ability to wall jump as well. In this kind of standard 2.5D setting, for the most part, they manage to avoid the trappings of a lot of 2.5D games that don't do it well, which is to have the foreground interfere with the background and it not be 100% clear what's what. For the most part, they managed to avoid that, which is good. I'm pretty glad of that. That's a big beef of mine. I really, really don't like it when they do that in 2.5D games. That's something that competent developers don't really do. And moments like these are probably the strongest parts of the game, honestly. The idea that you have to just kind of figure your way through the area. And they're not afraid of doing a bit of backtracking here and there as well. I've never felt lost in this game, even though they don't have a minimap. So that's quite cool as well. I'm pretty happy about that. They seem to have designed it in such a way that it makes sense, but they're not afraid of making you go back to do something if need be. It's not excessive. It's, I think, just the right amount of backtracking without making it super linear. Which is always nice. So, those elements are fine. The platforming is fine. I wouldn't call it exceptional, because I don't think it is, but there are definitely some cool moments, and there's a little bit of trickery involved in comboing things like wall jumping with the sliding and the gripping onto those kind of light emitter things. It's nice. It's satisfying. I like it. It's a shame the animation quality wasn't better, yeah? The jumps don't look particularly good at all. There's really barely any momentum there whatsoever. So it's difficult to find it as satisfying as I otherwise would have hoped to do. But the weakness definitely comes in the combat. And I think, honestly, it's unfortunate that they decided, you know what, we really need to just have this Mega Man-style arm cannon thing going on. Because the first 20 minutes of the game, I found the game quite interesting in the sense that you didn't have a way to fight stuff. You had to drive it away with your glare. And you had to, say, push it into a thorn to get rid of it. That was really interesting. And in my opinion, I feel you could have maybe based the entire game around that, yeah? Some basic platforming. Don't have the kind of whole hail of pointless laser bullets combat going on. Just make the enemies few and far between and integrate them with the way that the glare mechanic actually works, so you can drive them into traps and things like that. That, I think, would be a pretty interesting way of doing it. As it stands, though, this combat is really quite dull, I've got to say. The glare is more of a side thought at that point, and it's kind of, oh, it's quite nice, you know, you can kind of drive the enemies away and give yourself a little bit more time. It's not integral to the combat, you can very much survive without it. And that's unfortunate, because obviously it's the title of the game, so you'd expect that mechanic to have a little bit more importance behind just removing darkness and things like that. But it doesn't. And as a result, it gives way to what is otherwise a bog-standard action platformer that really doesn't have a huge amount going for it in that regard. And that's a real shame. Now, graphically, I don't find the game that impressive. It's certainly serviceable, but compared to games like Trine and Guiana Sisters that do a fantastic job of the 2.5D style, it's definitely not that impressive. Texture quality is not that good, and in combination with just a fairly dull aesthetic design, I think that the game really doesn't have anything going for it from the graphics point. I mean, at that point, if you're not going to have that kind of ability, if you're not going to have that kind of competence, then it's probably best to just go for straight 2D. I think 2.5D only really works when you've got an awful lot going for you in terms of your art style. And I don't, unfortunately, think that this game does have that. I'd love to say otherwise, but I just don't think that's true. I like the design of the main character. He's fairly interesting. But aside from that, the enemies are fairly generic, especially the bosses, which are probably the worst, because those two bosses are just giant globs, really, attached to a bunch of cables. And that is really about it. Like, wow, really? Is that it? That's all you could come up with? Unfortunately, yes, in the first 2 levels. I'm kind of hoping that they are able to change that, but yeah, it's a little disappointing, I gotta say. This stuff, the whole gliding aspect of things is where things get really, really good. Whole sliding, gliding, and doing all sorts of cool stuff. That's great. Checkpoints are a little bit too far apart as well, especially considering, as you noticed earlier, the game does have this tendency of throwing instant death scenarios at you. And they mostly involve thorns. Most of the time they can be avoided, but every now and again you can get bounced into one, which is the most infuriating thing in any game ever. I absolutely hate it when games do that. And this game has no qualms about that whatsoever. So if that's not the kind of mechanic that you enjoy, then I have a feeling that you are going to suffer greatly here. Now, I think looking at this, it looks like what I'm probably going to have to do is get rid of these, turn that on, and then do a slide down there and bounce onto the pad to be able to get up, which, and that's a nice piece of platforming. It's a shame that you have to redo so much of the bloody thing in order to get to that point, but that's a nice piece of platforming, and as I said before, I think the sliding is probably the best part of it. There we go. See, that's satisfying, that's fun. And more often than not, they give you a little bit of momentum into there as well, so you can do a little bit more sliding, and you can kind of really get your speed up, and that's nice. That's where the game is its strongest. But the game does insist on throwing so much of this just really dull combat at you. And you will get, I believe, an ability per world. And the first one was the arm cannon, and then you got the slide, and then there's a light bomb as well at some point. But honestly, up to this point, killing all of these purple enemies is kind of dull. There's also a little bugbear that I've got with it as well, which is the idea that they insist on not having a health bar. I guess the trend lately to just kind of get rid of the UI because you want your creative vision to shine through and not be interfered with by things like meters and nonsense like that. Unfortunately, that's pretty annoying, especially in this case, because what they decided to do with it was to set up a scenario where every time you get hit, the screen gets darker. And that's kind of designed, I suppose, to represent the fact that your starlight's going out or whatever. But unfortunately, that means it's just harder to see everything, and you really don't know... There we go. And you really don't know exactly how much damage you've taken. It's like, come on, we could really just do with a health bar here. There was no harm in it. Just give us a health bar. I can't say that I've had a huge amount of fun with it so far. It has its moments, definitely, and most of them involve sliding. Let's just say I like sliding. What can I say there? And the weakest parts of it have almost always been with the combat. And unfortunately, it kind of fails to generate this compelling world. I'm not really interested to find out what is going on with the story. The game doesn't have any voice acting or any real story to speak of. And the worlds aren't really interesting enough, and they're not really varied enough aesthetically to... Oh, okay, that was a cutscene and not me dying horribly, that's fine. They're not really varied enough aesthetically to have me wandering around exploring and really trying to find out the wonders of these particular levels. There don't appear to be that many of them, honestly. And that's a shame. That is a real shame. When I look at games like Trine, one of the most fun aspects of that game is exploring the wonderful fairy tale levels where basically nothing's impossible. And they're willing to throw all sorts of really interesting doodads and backgrounds and just thematic elements into it. And this game doesn't really have that, unfortunately. It's a lot of caves, it's a lot of green textures, there's a desert level, which is exactly how you would expect it to be. And there's nothing that kind of blew me away as, wow, this is really nicely designed from an aesthetic standpoint. Someone really wanted to create this set piece here. There isn't any of that, unfortunately. And it does leave me believing that the game's kind of a little bit uninspired. And that's really been my thought throughout the entire experience, is that, yeah, for the most part, the game works pretty well. Yeah, it is competent. It's that word that I've been using quite a lot lately. I guess I'm going through the same area again. All right. It's competent at what it does. The combat is competent, if actually completely bland in any other aspect. The platforming is competent with occasional flashes of really enjoyable stuff. The world design is competent, but nothing's blown me away. And let's be honest, platformers are not rare anymore. If this came out years ago when there just weren't really all that many platformers and everyone was hailing the possible revival of platformers, then maybe people would have looked at it and said, yeah, this is a bit special. But these days, there are a lot of better games available. And if I compare this to something like Trine, I just can't compare it favorably. It's just not possible. Or Giana Sisters, which is just better in terms of its production values, and even though it's not original in terms of the way that it works, because it obviously clones the older Giana Sisters game, they really reinvented what was otherwise a dead franchise. And they made a really solid game out of it. And they had a lot of that wonderment. Oh, God damn it, really. They had a lot of that wonderment when it comes to the actual design of the levels. There's a lot of really awesome stuff to look at there. And here, you just don't get that at all. A lot of rocks, a lot of thorns, a lot of purple things. And it just takes away the joy of exploring for me. So it really comes down to, hey, is the platforming any good? Which, thankfully, it kind of is. So, my conclusion on Glare, I think, has got to be that I don't really find it all that interesting. I have a feeling it will appeal to some people that are desperately looking for the kind of, I suppose, sort of Donkey Kong Country-esque action platformer. You know, there's a lot of bouncing, there's a lot of wall jumping and things like that. It doesn't really have enough of its own charm, I think, to carry it. And mechanically, it hasn't done anything that is interesting enough for me to warrant a thorough recommendation of it. It doesn't mean it's bad, it just means, look, we are in a time where there are a lot of really good games coming out in this genre around the same kind of price point. And as a direct result, it's hard to recommend anything but the really good ones because you are spoiled for choice. And I would have loved to see some more unique mechanics. I would have loved to see Glare, the actual mechanic of Glare, as opposed to the name of the game, taking a more of a front role, I suppose, yeah? And it doesn't really get that. It kind of, after the first 20 minutes, it kind of gets thrown into the background. It's just this little inconvenient thing that you kind of have to do every once in a while, instead of it being the key feature of the title. That, and again, the game's tendency to just kill you over and over again with these thorns is very, very irritating. So there you go, folks. That's a look at Glare. It's currently available for $15, your regional equivalent, on Steam. My name has been TotalBiscuit. Thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you next time.